Today my guest is Corey Haines. Corey, how you doing?
Hi, good to see you.
It's great to see you. It's great to have you on my show. You know, I've been recording conversations with you for a while, and there's always too much noise in the background. This is good. I got a good feeling about this.
Yeah, and it's not just me, my loud mouth making all the noise.
This is what I want. I thought, surprisingly, you didn't drown out an entire conference or an entire bar. I recorded one of the bar one time.
I remember that down in Tennessee, I think it was.
Somewhere. What do you want to talk about?
Well, everybody wants to talk to me about craftsmanship.
You know why? It's because you're so passionate
about
stuff.
It is. That's kind of what I do these days.
Let's talk about craftsmanship, but before we do that, craftsmanship is one of those words. Very overloaded. Yeah. It's hard to define. Do you have a definition of craftsmanship?
Well, for me, the software craftsmanship movement, it's about, well, the little catchphrase I use is that Agile and extreme programming, which is what I use, but Agile was about ways to develop better software. Okay. Software craftsmanship was about ways to develop better software developers.
Okay.
And so the thing that Agile was missing was you have all these great techniques. You know, XP has test-driven development and iterations and retrospectives and all these things, but they're hard. So how do you go about learning them? If you're a new developer and you see that people are saying this is how you should be writing code, or in a looser form, these are techniques that you could be using to write quality software.
Okay.
It's not the only way, but they're proven ways.
Right.
Great. How do you do it? How do I go from not knowing how to write an automated unit test to writing them very soon after my code, to writing them before my code, to using them to actually build designs and put pressure on my design?
So is craftsmanship about knowing the right way to use these tools?
Craftsmanship, for me, is about how do you learn to use the tools.
Okay, so maybe it's about learning. So craftsmanship, I know you said in the past there isn't enough. It's something that's lacking, I think, in our industry, right? So are we doing a poor job of teaching, and people are doing a poor job of learning? Is that the problem?
Absolutely. Okay. I like to think that I'm a reasonable example of it, that I came in, my first job, I was the only developer at the insurance arm of a major corporation.
You look like an insurance man.
Don't I? Don't I? I've got the suit on. I had been hacking around with code for about 13 years. I started programming when I was probably 11. Got my first job, career-wise when I was about 25. But I had been hacking away at code. I didn't know how to write actual quality software that, is going to be used at the enterprise level, that solves a need, that can be maintained, all of that stuff.
That's because nobody taught you that.
Nobody taught me how to do that.
Self-taught. So this is, I'm going to interject here because this is, I've thought about this a lot. This is the blessing and the curse of the PC revolution. The PCs, the Apple and IBM sort of left that market, but they made the PC accessible to individuals. Now, with a small investment, you can buy one of these things, put it in your house, and you can start writing code, you can learn code, you can start producing code, you can call yourself a consultant. It used to be in the old days, you had to go and work for a big company, and those people weren't going to hire you unless you had a lot of formal training, unless you had an advanced degree. And now it's much more accessible. A lot of good has come with that. Now there's a lot more software, a lot more good software being written. A lot of smart people that wouldn't be in the industry are now in the industry. But at the same time, there's less discipline.
Yeah.
So,
and one of the things that an analogy I use is we're at the same point that the medical industry was when a barber could get a jar of leeches and hang a medical sign out. There were good barbers who really knew how to correctly apply the leeches, and there were barbers who didn't, but all you needed was a jar of leeches. Right. And especially with some of the newer stuff, I tend to these days be more in the Ruby space, the Rails space.
But this isn't a Ruby thing or a .NET thing. This is an industry thing.
It's an industry thing. And Rails, for example, is so easy. And I was just telling somebody that the latest project that I started, within an hour and a half, we had a hosted solution running.
Right. So the barriers to entry aren't just financial; they're also intellectual.
It's nothing, and it's all set up for you. So it doesn't take much for you to say, well, I've hacked around a PHP for a little while. I'm going to learn Rails and start selling. I'm a Rails developer.
Right.
And
so
PHP.
That barrier to entry's come down, and now anybody can call themselves a Rails developer. And there's no measure of quality.
There's no measure of quality, and it's not just that there's no measure of quality, but there's no way to know that I'm not good. There's very little of that set career path. That as you come in, well, I'm a developer, and like Andy said at the keynote, that we had the same problem that the nursing profession had, which is you're a nurse. Whether you've been doing it a year or you've been doing it 30 years, right, you're a nurse. And no matter what my first job, I was a senior engineer. My first job.
Right, so that title becomes kind of meaningless when you
becomes
graduate
meaningless.
college doing that.
And that's one of the things that the craftsmanship analogies that we use with the apprenticeship and the journeyman kind of analogies are not titles as much as waypoints on your career.
Okay, so this is another term that you're borrowing from another industry. So I think of apprenticeship and journeyman from something like carpentry, one of the skilled construction trades, which I used to be in the construction trades. Be honest,
I didn't know that.
They're not. So just like doctors have addressed the barbers putting leeches on it by having rigorous training and barriers to entry that way to get into their profession, the skilled industrial trades have their barriers to entry that you must go through an apprenticeship program. You have to go to school, you have to have on-the-job training before you can actually call yourself a journeyman. You're proposing something very similar for the software industry?
Not as rigorous, because I don't think that we know enough about what it means to develop software. We don't have centuries of experience in this sort of thing.
Sure.
But what I am proposing, and a lot of us who are using these terms, and it's important to know that somebody once made the analogy that the software craftsmanship movement is like the Impressionist movement, in that there's no one, that's Impressionism. I mean, there are people who are very much considered in the software craftsmanship sort of arena who hate the term movement and absolutely abhor these words that we use, like apprentice and all of that stuff. And, great, it's fine. There are those of us who find it valuable, and what we're proposing is that the idea of an apprentice is starting to establish a base set of practices. So when I'm starting, I know nothing. I don't have any set practices. I might be able to hack out some code, and that's great. But having set, I do test-driven development. I've been doing test-driven development for nearly 6 years now. It's an established way. When the pressure is on and when I have to write code as fast as I can, I fall back to the techniques I know, and test-driven development is one of those.
Yep.
But it took me years to establish that as my base practice. Once you establish your base practice and say, okay, when a new project comes up, I can describe to you, these are the techniques I use. The techniques I use now with TDD are not the same as they were 6 years ago, but the principles are the same.
Okay.
So once you have that, then it's time to say, okay, I now know how to develop software. My view is that it's probably about, I would like to say about 7 or 8 years long while you're establishing these things.
Well, before you can call yourself a journeyman.
Yeah, I really try not to, I don't get to say when people get to call or anything like that.
Well, state your opinions.
But it's...
You're not, imagine you're the king of the universe.
Yeah, well, I am the king of the universe, but the idea is that once you've established that, and I don't think it can be less than about 7 years.
Okay.
Some people it can.
So let me just interrupt. So your test-driven development, in your opinion, is an essential tool every software developer should master in order to be an effective software developer. Is that one of the essential tools?
I feel that if you are doing object-oriented programming, of some form, whether you're in a language like C# or you're in a language like Ruby or a small talk. I've talked to a lot of people and I've written a lot of code in my life, and I have yet to see a more effective way to write long-term maintainable software than test-driven development.
Okay. So what you're talking about is a way of ensuring that everybody gets that education of how to use test-driven development and how to assure it, because that's an essential piece, in your opinion, of writing good object-oriented code.
Yeah, if you don't write, I mean, even ignoring the fact that it lends really good pressure to your designs and adds some maintainability, in this day and age, with the tool sets we have, I fully believe and agree with the statement that if you are not doing automated unit testing, preferably before you write the code, then you are doing a disservice to your customer, and you are not able to say that your code works in the long run. And you are, frankly, you know, Uncle Bob makes the bold statement, Bob Martin, and I agree with him, you're not a professional.
Okay.
And I'm sorry. In this day and age, then you are not yet a professional software developer if you are not doing these sorts of techniques or working towards understanding how to do them. If you can come, like, there's people who do what's called design by contract. I don't know design by contract. I've worked a little tiny bit with it, and I've worked with people. So I can't say that that is not also an effective way to do it, because I don't have the experience to say that. The things that I do know is that both the people I've talked to who do that and the people I talk to who do test-driven development, for example, can describe to you their process for writing software. It's not an ad hoc, I write some code, I go into the debugger, I run the app, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, I don't know how I'm verifying that I haven't broke anything, and I did that for a long time. And you know what, I wrote software that worked.
Yeah.
And you can write software that works like that.
It's the maintainability.
The maintainability suffers, and frankly, if you are doing something and you're doing it over and over again, and you cannot explain to me or explain to somebody what the process is that you use, and it's not set in, it should be changing over time as you learn more about it. Mm-hmm. But at any point in time, you should be able to say, this is how I develop software. Because by doing that, you've said, I've studied my craft to the point where I can tell you, this is how I am effective.
All right, so I'm getting a good picture about your vision of what a good software developer, what you refer to as a craftsman or a journeyman, should strive for, and ways to get there. Practicing learning about things like test-driven development, having a defined approach that you can articulate and justify. But how do we get there? And in fact, let's look at a practical example. Mm-hmm. I work for a consulting company. There are a number of people in my group, a lot more young. I'd like to, what advice would you give me to say, I want to make sure that these people that are have a few years experience and not much formal training beyond college to get to what you consider a craftsman?
Well, I think the places that I've seen that are really effective at that have formalized mentoring programs.
Okay, so that's another, mentoring. That's another term that means a lot of things to a lot of people.
Personally, I feel that if you bring somebody into your company and they are new, they've probably been writing code before and everything, but if you sit them down in front of a computer and say, oh, here's a bunch of requirements, write the code, you're doing them a disservice.
And that's more common than that.
It's more common. I've had it happen to me. Mm-hmm. Luckily, I've also had the other case happen where I go in, and even if I've got several years of experience or something, I'll go in and they'll pair you up with somebody. And some places do pair programming. I'm a firm believer in it. Some places don't, but they pair you up with a mentor who is going to be reviewing your code with you.
Yeah.
And potentially even, like, there's a company called 8flight in Chicago that has active mentoring and apprenticeship programs. And when they bring somebody into their apprentice program, that person's given, they're assigned a mentor, and that mentor walks them through some practice problems. Micah Martin, one of the owners, one of his favorites is to write tic-tac-toe. He tells them, he sits them down and says, write a tic-tac-toe game that I cannot beat. It's a fairly, I mean, we know how to win tic-tac-toe,
right.
or
so
at least go to a draw.
This is almost an academic exercise just for them to practice their coding skills.
They come back with a solution. He then actively critiques it with them and shows them how to, oh, here's something that you could do better.
Okay.
And over time, so mentoring of that nature and accepting that somebody who comes in as a junior level person or an entry level person needs that. They need to have somebody walking them through the paces. How do you write maintainable systems? What are some of the obvious things you can do to write maintainable systems? And it's different depending on what field or what technology you're using.
Sure. Or what industry you're working in.
Or what industry you're working in. And how maintainable does it have to be? How malleable? If you're writing software for a small business, it has to be much more malleable than it does for a large enterprise. Because a small business, their business model changes more frequently than a large enterprise. And a large enterprise also has pretty deep pockets. So if you write a system that maybe every 3-4 years you need to rewrite it, that's more viable. I'm not saying it's the most viable thing in the world.
There's also trade-offs as well. You could argue that a large corporation would be more likely to need a very scalable solution. And there's only so many hours in the day, there's only so many man hours to work on the process. And are you going to make it more scalable, more maintainable, add more features? There's a lot of things that you can only do so much. So you have to make decisions.
Yeah, and how do you know what those decisions, especially if you've been working on, say you've been working on open source through your teen years, and you come in and suddenly you're working in an environment where, one, you don't get to use open source, and two, they don't really care about all of that stuff. They want, like you said, I want something that I can put up on the server and 10,000 people can hit it in a minute.
Right. Or it has zero downtime.
Or zero downtime. You have to be mentored with somebody to understand what it is in that world and what it is in that industry means good software.
Yeah, so I agree. What I've seen is a lot of companies will invest in things like boot camps, trying to get people up to speed, teach them the technology very quickly, and then at that point they get, I don't know, sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it's months. Significant investment, and then they get to the point where, okay, throw them in the water, let them swim, put them on a project. And I see very little of that formal mentoring that you're talking about.
So here's my dream. Okay, I've got a 15-year dream.
Okay.
My 15-year dream is to have small clusters of companies, and these tend to be small consulting shops, not large enterprises, because that's a whole different world. But when somebody wants to get into software and they want to have a career in development, each of these clusters would have sort of entry points which are schools.
Okay.
So it would be more of like a learning, like a dental school, where you there actually go in and if you've ever gone to one, it's cheaper. You go in, the person's cleaning your teeth.
Oh, okay. I haven't been there, but I've been to the barber school.
The barber school is another example.
Which is, they're fine, but it usually takes like an hour and a half.
It takes an hour and a half.
Oh, and I've been to the cooking school as well.
And the cooking school, it takes a long time. But, so, I want to set up a school like that, where you go through like a 2-year program, where you go from zero to a basic knowledge of on-the-job doing client work, and learn those techniques with active mentoring. Then, once you come out of that, there are other consulting companies which are more focused. Part of their mission is to do mentoring. There's a lot of these companies out there, and evangelize that I mentioned is one of them. They then can take these people who are ready, who have a basic knowledge. They have good practices that they've been using for a couple years, and train them from that 2-year sort of beginner up to where they have those established practices and then that person can go out and do what you need to do. When you can describe your process, I consider that sort of, in my view, that's your apprenticeship phase, is getting to the point where you have sort of internalized a set of techniques for developing software that you use and you're successful at, and you've proven them to be successful over several projects.
Yeah.
Then once you get through that, that's when I consider, you know, I like the term journeyman because I like to travel, but the post apprenticeship phase is when you realize that you're successful writing software in a certain way. And wow, there's somebody else who is also successful, but they do it differently than you. And that's not possible, because of course my way is the best. You can't possibly be successful if you're doing it differently than I am. So your goal and your job, and this is something that I've been doing a lot, is go to that person or go to that company and find out how they work. Because if they're successful, and they are successful in a way, in, you know, whatever definition of success you want, then going and working with them, you're going to pick up things from them.
Right, so you may not mimic what they're doing exactly. No. You certainly could learn things from any
Absolutely. If they're successful, they have stuff to teach you. You're successful, you have stuff to teach them. Then what happens is you start to take your practices and start actually molding it. You've spent your apprenticeship phase, I don't want to say blindly accepting, but accepting what somebody is teaching you.
You're being led.
You're being led, and you should be led while you establish those practices. And once you have them down, then it's time to look around and go, okay, let me start changing and let me add little things. Ooh, I don't really like, that part has always been sort of a nag to me.
All right, so
here's somebody else.
So you talked about this dream, mm-hmm. and it sounds kind of like a school. Mm-hmm. Is this really a dream, or is it something you're putting some concrete plans in action to make this?
Well, I have, for the school part of it, I have a 3-year plan.
Including financial things and things like that.
Yeah. So the 3 years, for the next 3 years, everything I do is headed towards learning how to effectively start this school.
Okay. Are you talking about, I know you just moved from Cleveland mm-hmm. to Chicago. Are you talking about the Midwest to start out?
Most likely it'll be Chicago. Okay. If things go as they do, there's a lot of my arm of the software craftsmanship arena tends to be centered a lot in Chicago. So you've got Optiva and 8th Light and Object Mentor and some of these, the more vocal people in our arm of it.
Okay.
The so-called software craftsmanship movement kind of thing.
I didn't know that.
They tend to be focused. There's people all over.
Yeah.
But it kind of started spread out from Chicago for this aspect, and so that's kind of where I'm going to be starting this, and then the long-term plan is that being the basis for some other stuff that I'm doing with some companies to have a pretty set career, not a set career path, but a set way that somebody can bounce, I go to this shop where I'm being mentored up, and then I go to this other shop where they hire top-line people. And they aren't really focused on mentoring people. They're focused on somebody who's got a lot of experience, can come in, crank it out, and crank it out well because they've learned how to shrink the line between getting it done and doing it right.
Now you're talking kind of like an internship program here, right? Where you move from one company to another?
No, it's really just you've been here for 4 or 5 years. It's probably time for you to move on to another place because that's how you're going to learn.
Okay.
Is you're going to move to another. But you have these small clusters where if you wanted to, you could spend a lot of your career going from a shop that you're being mentored to a shop where you're really focused on really getting a lot of good stuff done.
Is that optimal, or is it better to stay where you are and just become one of the mentors as new people come up through there?
I'd like people to come back to mentor. Mm-hmm. So go out and work in a company that is purely about doing high quality, quick work for large places and just doing fantastic things. That will solidify all of the stuff you've had because you're constantly going to be pushed. You're going to be with people who expect you to be performing at a certain level.
Okay.
And you perform at that level, then come back. And I would love, some people won't.
Sure.
You know, some people aren't really cut out, and that's not their goal to be.
But you're saying, again, I'm talking your dream and some of the practical aspects of it. You're thinking of you'd be the facilitator between these companies to help.
I would like to
either move or at least discover the opportunities in these various companies.
I would like to
and facilitate the learning and the mentoring.
Facilitate the learning. One of the things like now that I'm doing is you're seeing more. I don't know if you've heard about these craftsman swaps.
No. What's that?
So last year was the first one we did, and 8th Light and Aptiva, they basically had that idea of, wow, you know, wouldn't it be great if one of our senior developers could go work at another company for a little bit of time to find out how they do it, and then they could learn a bit, bring it back. So they got together. We sat down one Saturday to hash out some of the business problems.
Well, you helped.
I facilitated this just to get them together. They were
aware of each other.
They were aware of each other, and that was in February of last year. They then in April did a swap. So for a week, they just swapped 2 senior level people. No money and no nothing. It was just you get up, you go to that place now, and work there for a week.
And they came back and they brought some knowledge with them.
Brought knowledge back. They the businesses benefited, the people benefited. They're now, this year, we're going to start seeing more of these. There's Company Relevance is going to be doing it with Aptiva as well, swapping actually next week. And there's going to be more. I'm working with some companies to start talking about this and make them less ad hoc, not formalized, but just less ad hoc, so that you can have companies that kind of need, okay, I could benefit from something like this. Here's another company that has that and could benefit from something they have. The best way to do that is to have somebody who can go and work at this company for a month. Go work at this company for a month. Go work at this company for a month. And start to learn the culture there, talk to them and figure out what it is, but working. Right. So actually they are delivering software with the other people, because that really helps you find out. And that's kind of the role that I've played off and on and loosely over the past year, and that we're starting to talk about whether or not that's a role that could be a little more, I like a little less ad hoc rather than a little more formal, because formal feels to me like it's got a lot of structure and things around it, but less ad hoc of me driving my car to a city and going, hey, can I hang out here and program with you?
You just did, you were driving up and down the East Coast for the last 6 months or so.
A year. I drove around for a year, and it was a blast, and I learned a lot. But there's a lot of companies that are dedicated to some of these principles and want to have, you know, it would be good to have sort of a conduit between them.
Yeah, it's an interesting model, and I think you're working with companies that are sort of already aware of this concept, they're already aware of each other, but there's also a lot of companies out there that aren't aware of this at all. And so if you can sort of evangelize that in a broader audience, then more people can benefit from that.
Yeah, and I try to be loud, and my role is, I see my role not as going out and convincing people, as much as standing on a hill, waving my flag, and screaming loudly. And some people will notice. Some people will notice and be like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And some people will actively try to quiet me down. Not actively, I mean, not really bad.
I've heard you say this before, that this isn't for everybody.
It's not. Not even close.
Maybe the big insurance company you worked for before, it's probably not ideal for them. They've got a big structure, and they've got their way of doing things, and that's fine.
It's perfectly
they're still
okay.
in business.
Yeah, I mean, we're not coming out saying that everybody has to be a craftsman, and you know, personally, I don't call myself a craftsman. I am a software developer.
Okay.
I think that I like to say I'm in the journeyman phase of my career. There's places that call their employees craftsmen, and people who like to call themselves craftsmen, and it's great because it gives them a feeling of identity.
But
I don't really like craftsmen because for the same reason I don't like to be called an engineer. In that,
why is that?
I don't really know what a craftsman is.
Okay, that's how we started this whole thing.
Yeah,
It's a hard term to define.
It's a hard term to define. In my mind, I've defined what I mean by apprenticeship and journeyman there. So I can identify with that because I've made it up.
So at least you know what it means.
Well, it's what I know what it means. And, but the whole craftsmanship principles and the craftsmanship ideas, they're not for everybody, and they shouldn't be for everybody. And in fact, just the term itself has already been so diluted. I mean, you have, I read a blog post the other day where somebody said that they really like the software craftsmanship principles of test-driven development and pair programming and all of these, which are basically the XP principles, or the XP techniques. But awesome. If that's how you see it, fantastic.
So everybody's got their own definition of what is craftsmanship.
Yeah, as long as it's not a term you use to sort of give yourself an excuse to do bad stuff, or I guess I can't really think of any great examples, but occasionally I'll see it. People try to use it, and they're just using the term. And
sure, yeah, they use the term architect a lot.
Yeah,
it's just sort of an ego booster. In fact, even companies will use that. They'll assign that term to people.
Yeah,
just as a way of rewarding them. It's sort of a meaningless term.
Yeah, and they'll say, "Oh, we're all about practice," and they'll say, "Well, I practice." The thing about practice is that it's solving a problem, and it's like, well, it is in a way, but if you're practicing an instrument, it's a very valuable practice is to work on fundamentals, things like that. So if you get together and you, say you're doing a, we'll pick on coding dojos, and you're doing a coding dojo, and we have one here, and people are in there programming, and it's great. Because anytime you get people programming, it's better than not programming.
Sure.
But for me, at least, having a coding dojo where your goal is to finish the problem, you're just doing what you do every day at work. And if you finish the problem, you've probably not done anything new or stretched yourself at all. You just rushed and, it will have a benefit because you'll be faster at work for whatever.
What's a better goal?
A better goal is to take small practices. Say, for example, I do TDD. When I'm practicing, I don't just do it how I normally do it. One of my favorites is this practice called TDD as if you meant it, which is, according to the rules of TDD, is you write the simplest test possible, you write the simplest code possible, you refactor. Then you come back and you do the same thing again. So, at our code retreats that we do, we solve Conway's Game of Life. And it's there's cells and they grow, live and die and all that. Oh. So a lot of times you start with, I'm going to TDD a cell class. Well, what test caused you to have a cell abstraction? Why are you just not testing the code in your test method? And you don't code like that in real life when you're in production. So you'll code it here, you'll code it in another test method, notice the duplication, extract it into a method, write more against that method, have another test class doing the same. Now you've got two methods, there's duplication, you extract that out into a class, you start building your abstractions that way. Very fine-tuned test-driven development. The benefit of that is if you can drop back to basics, then when you are stuck on a problem and you've got, kind of a block, I don't know what I should do next, if you can drop back a level, and back a level, and back a level, eventually you get to where you can just write code. And just like if you're writing an essay or something, get words out there. It's easier to edit and refactor than it is to come up with it from scratch.
True. Yes.
So just get code out there. So I like to practice the very basic fundamentals. At one of the code retreats we did, some guys said, we're going to write this as though we're in the 70s, and running the application costs money. So they spent 45 minutes, which are the session length at code retreats, and they didn't run their app once.
I see. So they just write it all on paper.
Yeah, and
submit their punch cards.
Yeah, and doing those sorts of things, which are not how you do it when you are trying to get it done in practice. But if you can practice the fundamentals and the way that you would like to do it, if I had enough time and I was as good as I could be very, very effective by taking very small steps at TDD. How do you get to that point where when you have to get it done, you use the best possible practices? Well, you practice the best possible practices.
Yeah, so that's the old perfect practice makes perfect.
Perfect practice makes perfect. I always say that the difference between what you think you should be doing and what you do when you get it done is a measure of how much you suck. And the way that you shrink that, so people say, well, I really believe I should be doing TDD, but there's sometimes when you got to get it done.
Right.
Well, you know what? I'm as effective and as fast as a lot of people I know doing test-driven development, but I've been doing it for 6 years.
Yeah.
I wasn't at the beginning.
It's come second nature, so you're much faster at that. It doesn't have that cost that it does.
It doesn't. But it's only because I've practiced it and practiced it and practiced it. And so taking the fundamentals and working on those and practicing them over and over again. One of the projects that I'm on now is this series called Kata Casts, which we practice a small kata, get it to where it takes about 10 minutes to do it. So one of the ones that I did was was converting a number into its LED equivalent.
Okay. Yeah. Is it 8 bars?
Yeah, 8 bars. And I practiced it until I was pretty. This is how I would do it if I was magical, and if I was how I would like to do it. And then what we do is we perform it to music, and we screencast it. Wonderful to watch. I love watching.
Is that available on your blog?
It's on katacast.com. You can link everything. Links from CoreyHaines.com.
CoreyHaines.com is where you got your link to KataCast, your blog,
my blog,
your videos that you shoot,
videos that I shoot. Everything's there, and a lot of the stuff that I talk about is there. But we practice the fundamentals. People say, "Well, this is an easy problem." Yeah, it is. But practice, and like you said, with the practice makes perfect. When I first time I heard that, I was learning the violin as a teenager. Thought, it was great. Einstein played the violin. I should play the violin. And my teacher one time, I said, I've been practicing a lot, and she said, "You are awful." And I said, "Well, I've been practicing." She said, "You're practicing wrong." She's like, "Practice makes permanent. Perfect practice makes perfect." And that's really the goal of all of this, is to spend time to where you can roll out an example of how, if I was magical and the best programmer I can be, this is how I would like to do it. You do that enough times, it's second nature.
All right, that's a good place to wrap up here.
Fantastic.
I can talk to you for a long time.
Yeah, I can talk.
But I want to save something for the next time.
Definitely.
But Corey, thanks so much.
I'm so glad you finally got to.
I know, we've been hanging around here at Kalahari for 2 days, and I hardly saw you.
Yeah. Well, it's been a great conference, and normally I'm bouncing around outside talking to people, but the sessions this year have been they're generally good, but they've been top notch this year, and I'm really happy with this. I've been to Code Mash every year, and I love it.
All right, thanks a lot.
All right. So the thing I love about technology is it's not just working in a community of professionals, but I find that I get to work in a community of my friends.